Welcome back, everyone. We've got a really fascinating deep dive lined up for you today based on the material you sent our way.
Can't wait to dig in.
So, we're taking a look at an excerpt from an online piece called I'm a Foreigner.
Okay, I'm intrigued already.
The author is Jaime Hoerricks, a PhD and special education teacher, and it's all about exploring what it means to feel like a foreigner, even in familiar surroundings.
Interesting. I mean, we usually think of foreigner in a geographical sense.
Exactly. But Horrocks goes beyond that some geography to examine how this feeling of foreignness plays out in different aspects of life, social, communicative, even in terms of identity.
So it's more about feeling like an outsider regardless of your actual location.
Precisely. And what's even more fascinating is that Horrocks approaches this topic from their perspective as both an autistic individual and a transgender woman.
Oh, wow, that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to hear how those experiences intersect.
It's really powerful stuff. Horrocks starts by sharing this incident that happened during a professional development session. You know those I am not exercises.
Oh, yeah, those can be tough for anyone.
Right. Imagine navigating that as a nonverbal autistic person.
Yeah, I can see how that could be incredibly challenging.
So Horrocks starts to write, I am a foreigner, I am not, and then time runs out.
Okay, and
A colleague, kind of innocently, asks Horrocks, where were you born?
seems like a harmless question on the surface.
It totally does. But for Horrocks, that simple question about birthplace triggers all these complex emotions. It's amazing how a seemingly innocuous question can unearth so much.
It's like that question cracked open a deeper sense of foreignness that had nothing to do with geography.
It's like that question cracked open a deeper sense of foreignness that had nothing to do with geography. It reminded them of all the times they felt out of sync with their surroundings because of things like communication styles or social norms.
Right, so it's more about feeling out of place even when you're physically present.
Exactly. And this incident actually leads into a discussion of Horrocks' a past shrouded in mystery, actually.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. Tell me more.
So, get this, Horrocks didn't even receive formal confirmation they were adopted until after they'd left for college.
Wow, that's late. What happened?
Their birth certificate was full of inconsistencies, like a fictionalized account of their origins.
So they didn't really know the truth about their own beginnings.
Not for a long time. It took decades to slowly piece together fragments of their true story.
Imagine not knowing your true origins until adulthood. That must have been a really challenging journey.
Definitely. That search for belonging, for understanding their roots, is a major theme that Horrocks grapples with. And then you add another layer to this feeling of foreignness, their experience with language.
Okay, so how does language fit into all of this?
Well, they were raised in a mostly nonverbal environment.
Really?
And get this, they primarily absorbed language from British television.
British television. That's
Yeah.
amazing. No wonder they felt like a foreigner.
Right. Imagine growing up sounding completely different from everyone around you.
It makes you realize how important language is in shaping our sense of belonging.
It really does. And this actually leads us to a really interesting concept that Horrocks introduces, having versus being.
Okay, I'm listening. Break that down for me.
So they draw on the philosophy of Erich Fromm to make this distinction.
Okay, Eric Fromm, the philosopher and social psychologist.
That's right. The land of having represents the neurotypical world, a world obsessed with possessions, achievements, external validation, that sort of thing.
Got it.
And then there's the land of being, which reflects the autistic experience, emphasizing intrinsic qualities, authentic self-expression, connection.
So it's about who you are versus what you have.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Can you give me a real-life example of how this plays out?
Absolutely. Think about education. In the land of having, it's often all about getting good grades, earning degrees, checking off those boxes.
Yeah, been there.
But for many autistic individuals, learning is more about genuine curiosity, the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of understanding something deeply.
Right, it's about the process of learning itself, not just the end result.
Exactly. And Horrocks actually gives a name to this land of being, Varen's land.
Varensland, that's a beautiful word. What does it mean?
It's a symbolic place, a haven for those who feel like foreigners in the land of having, a place where being your true self is not only accepted but celebrated.
I love that. It really captures that feeling of finally finding where you truly belong.
And remember, Hoerricks is writing all of this from their perspective as an autistic trans woman, so these experiences of foreignness are amplified through the lens of gender identity as well.
Right, so it's about navigating a world that often has very rigid expectations about gender roles and expression.
Absolutely. It's about feeling the pressure to conform, to fit into a binary system that doesn't always feel true to who you are.
So there's this parallel between the autistic experience and the transgender experience. Both involve a sense of not fitting into those societal expectations.
And both involve a need to define oneself on one's own terms. This is where the idea of self-declaration becomes really important.
Self-declaration.
Yeah, Hoerricks talks about it in relation to both their adoption story and their transgender journey.
What do they say about it?
Well, both experiences involve these discrepancies between official records like their birth certificate or legal documents and their own personal truth.
So self-declaration becomes about reclaiming ownership of your narrative, of your identity.
Exactly. It's about saying, this is who I am, regardless of what society might say or what my documents might claim.
Powerful stuff. It's about honoring that inner knowing, that lived experience, even when it conflicts with external labels.
It really is. And I think Hoerricks' story highlights just how important it is to create space for people to define themselves authentically.
Absolutely. It's about creating a world where people feel safe and empowered to embrace who they are without feeling the pressure to conform.
And I think that's something we can all strive for. Whether we identify as autistic, transgender, or something else entirely, we all have those moments where we feel like we don't quite fit in.
Right. We've all had those experiences of feeling like a foreigner in some way.
Exactly. And those experiences can teach us so much about empathy, understanding, and the importance of creating a more inclusive world. But before we jump into those bigger questions,
It really is. And it makes you think, what can we do to help people feel less like foreigners in their own lives?
that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think Hoerricks gives us some really valuable starting points. Remember that professional development session where it all began? The one that focused on microaggressions?
Yes, and that seemingly simple question from Hoerricks' colleague, where were you born, turned out to be quite triggering.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how microaggressions can operate. They often fly under the radar, but they can have a real impact on people.
Right, just because something seems harmless on the surface doesn't mean it can't be hurtful.
And for our listener, it might be helpful to define what we mean by microaggressions.
Definitely. So microaggressions are these subtle and often unintentional expressions of bias or prejudice.
They can be comments, actions, even just assumptions that make someone feel othered or marginalized.
In this case, the question about birthplace unintentionally invalidated Hoerricks' feelings of being a foreigner.
Yeah, like it was implying that the only valid form of foreignness is geographical.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder for all of us to be mindful of the questions we ask and the assumptions we make.
You never know what someone else might be carrying with them or what past experiences a simple question might trigger.
I think we've all been on the receiving end of a microaggression at some point, whether we realized it at the time or not.
It's definitely a call for greater empathy and awareness in our daily interactions. We need to be more attuned to the subtle ways in which our words and actions can affect those around us.
Couldn't agree more. And this ties back to Hoerricks' whole concept of feeling like a foreigner. It's
Yeah.
not just about geographic location or even identity,
Yeah.
It's about feeling out of sync with the dominant culture, with those unspoken social norms that everyone else seems to just get.
And it can happen even in seemingly ordinary, everyday interactions. Think about those times when you felt out of place, even in familiar settings.
We've all been there. Like you walk into a room and you just feel different.
Exactly. And I think Hoerricks' perspective as both an autistic individual and a trans woman is so valuable here.
Absolutely. It's like they're offering a unique lens for examining these bigger societal issues of inclusion and belonging.
They're showing us all those ways we can unintentionally create barriers and make people feel like outsiders.
Precisely. And their experiences highlight the intersectionality of identity, how those different parts of who we are, our race, gender, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, and so on, can amplify these feelings of being a foreigner.
It's not just one thing. It's the way all of those identities come together and shape our experiences.
Exactly. For example, Hoerricks talks about how the rigid expectations around gender often make them feel like they don't belong in a binary world.
There's this added layer of foreignness on top of their experiences as an autistic person.
And it emphasizes how important it is to create spaces where people feel safe and empowered to be their authentic selves, you know, without feeling pressure to conform to some external standard.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of Hoerricks' vision of Varinsland, remember?
Of course,
Yeah.
a place where being your true self is celebrated, not just tolerated,
It's like this beautiful vision of a more inclusive and equitable world.
where differences are seen as strengths and everyone feels a sense of belonging.
And that's something worth striving for, isn't it? But before we get too idealistic, we need to come back to another key aspect of Hoerricks' experience, that whole question about birthplace and the complexities of adoption.
Right, that was really powerful. It highlighted the emotional toll of having a fragmented personal history
Of not knowing the full truth of your origins for such a long time.
and how that can contribute to feeling like a foreigner, like a piece of you is missing.
It's a reminder that adoption, while a beautiful act of family creation, can also involve layers of loss, trauma, and unresolved questions.
Definitely. And Hoerricks' search for information about their biological family underscores the deep human need for connection and belonging.
It's that need to know where we fit in,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And for adopted individuals, that search can be incredibly complex.
They have to navigate so much secrecy, conflicting information, all the emotional weight of their unique circumstances.
It's a lot to carry.
Hoerricks' story also raises some ethical and legal questions about adoption. For instance, why were the birth parents made to give up all parental rights and swear off contact?
And why were the records sealed? What societal norms and pressures were at play back then?
It's a reminder of the power dynamics at play in adoption and the need for more transparency and accountability moving forward.
Definitely. We need to make sure the rights and interests of all parties involved, birth parents, adoptive parents, and, of course, the adoptee, are protected.
And recognizing that adoption is a journey that unfolds over a lifetime, not just a one-time event. So as we reflect on everything Hoerricks has shared, what are some key takeaways about adoption that our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, we need to remember that adoption is a complex and multifaceted experience. There's no single narrative that can fully capture the range of emotions, challenges, and triumphs that come with it.
It's a reminder to approach conversations about adoption with sensitivity and avoid making generalizations or assumptions.
Right. Every story is unique and personal.
And secondly, I think Hoerricks' story really highlights the importance of acknowledging the losses and traumas associated with adoption.
It's not always a happy ever after fairy tale.
There can be genuine pain and grief, and it's important to create space for those emotions to be expressed.
Absolutely. We can't just pretend those difficult feelings don't exist.
And third, we need to recognize the ongoing need for support and resources for adopted individuals.
This could be anything: access to information about their birth families, counseling, support groups.
Places where they can connect with others who share similar experiences and know they're not alone.
Exactly. And finally, we need to advocate for ethical and legal frameworks that promote transparency and accountability in adoption practices.
This includes ensuring that adoptees have access to the information they need to understand their own histories and identities.
It's about creating a system that prioritizes the well-being and best interests of everyone involved.
Right, because adoption is a lifelong process, not a single event.
And it's a process that impacts everyone involved: birth parents, adoptive families, and of course the adoptees themselves. But turning back to Hoerricks' central theme for a moment, what have we learned so far about the human experience of feeling like a foreigner?
I think what's really striking is how this feeling can manifest in so many different ways, and it's not always tied to something as obvious as geographic location. It can be about so much more.
Right. It can be about feeling out of sync with social norms, about struggling to communicate effectively, or even feeling like you don't belong in your own body.
It's about feeling constantly out of step with the world around you, like you're always trying to catch up to figure out those unwritten rules that everyone else seems to know instinctively.
And I think Hoerricks' work is a call for greater empathy and understanding in bridging those divides.
It's about recognizing that everyone has a story.
And those experiences shape how we move through the world.
It's about listening to those stories without judgment and trying to see the world through someone else's eyes.
And it's about challenging our own biases. You know, we all have blind spots.
We're all capable of making someone feel like an outsider, even if we don't intend to. So what can we do, both as individuals and as a society, to create a world where fewer people feel like foreigners in their own lives?
We need to foster a culture of curiosity and openness.
A willingness to learn from those who have different experiences than our own. to ask questions and really listen to the answers.
And we need to challenge the societal norms and expectations that contribute to these feelings of exclusion.
That can mean anything from how we represent different identities in the media to the policies we create in our institutions.
It's about creating spaces where everyone feels welcomed, respected, and valued for who they are.
Recognizing that diversity is a strength, not something to be feared or erased.
It's about embracing the richness and complexity of human experience and understanding we all have something unique to offer. So to wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What are some small but meaningful steps you can take in your own life to create a more inclusive environment?
It's a question worth pondering. The answers will be different for everyone, but the important thing is to start somewhere.
To take those first steps toward building a world where everyone feels like they belong.
And I think Hoerricks' work provides a valuable guide for this journey. It's a reminder that even small acts of kindness, understanding, and advocacy can make a real difference in the lives of others. Welcome back. I don't know about you, but after that last part, I was really thinking about all the ways people end up feeling like outsiders.
Yeah, there are a lot.
And something that keeps coming back to me is how much of it comes down to language.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, we have the literal example from Hoerricks' story, right? Developing language primarily through British television.
Creating this immediate sense of being different, of sounding different.
Exactly. But then there's also the language we use to categorize and define people, the labels we attach, the boxes we try to put people in.
All of those can be incredibly alienating.
Right. And it all comes back to Hoerricks' point about having versus being. The land of having is so focused on labels, on diagnoses.
While the land of being is about accepting people for who they are, for how they experience the world, not some external marker. And this brings us to a really crucial conversation that's happening in both the autistic and transgender communities right now.
About self-diagnosis and self-identification.
Yes. Hoerricks actually talks about this too. They acknowledge the privilege they have in having a formal diagnosis of autism.
Right. Not everyone has access to those resources or even feels comfortable pursuing a formal diagnosis.
Exactly. But Hoerricks also recognizes the limitations and potential gatekeeping that can come with relying solely on formal diagnoses.
So, in a way, self-declaration is about recognizing that people have a right to define their own identities and experiences, regardless of whether they have a piece of paper from a doctor.
Absolutely. It's about trusting people's self-knowledge and lived experience.
And not just dismissing someone's experience because it doesn't fit neatly into a predetermined category.
And this becomes especially important when you consider the history of both autism and transgender identity.
Both communities have faced so much pathologization and marginalization over the years.
Self-declaration becomes about reclaiming power.
It's about saying, I know myself better than anyone else, and I have the right to define who I am.
Exactly. And it connects to a larger conversation about representation and inclusion, too.
About whose voices are being heard and whose stories are being told.
We need to make space for those who have been traditionally marginalized to define themselves on their own terms.
Rather than relying on these dominant narratives that often end up perpetuating stereotypes and misunderstandings.
It's about shifting the power dynamics and making sure everyone has a seat at the table.
I think Hoerricks' work is a powerful example of what can happen when we center those voices, those experiences that have been pushed to the margins for far too long.
It challenges us to really examine our assumptions.
To expand our understanding of what it means to be human.
And to create a world where everyone feels like they belong.
Because at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? To find a place where we can be ourselves authentically and fully, surrounded by people who understand and accept us.
A place where the idea of foreignness becomes a celebration of diversity.
Instead of a source of isolation.
Exactly. I think that's a beautiful vision to strive for.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into Jaime Hoerricks' work. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did.
We always love hearing your thoughts, so let us know what resonated with you. What new insights did you gain?
Keep asking questions.
Keep listening to diverse voices.
And keep challenging the status quo.
That journey of self-discovery and understanding is ongoing.
And it's a journey we can take together.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep and keep those curious minds engaged.